It is a confounding discovery that is rocking the very foundations of what we thought we knew about the origins of civilization.
These are the big questions. I think to answer these, we have to go inside and have a closer look.
There is a moment in science when the answer you were sent to confirm turns around and stares back at you like a stranger. That is exactly what happened when researchers sat down with two sets of genetic data, one ancient, one modern, and pressed them together for comparison. What they expected was confirmation. What they got was a question so deep it has not stopped echoing. The civilization in question is Sumer. Not Rome, not Egypt, not Greece. Sumer, the oldest complex civilization in the written record. The people who gave the world its first cities, its first legal codes, its first literature, its first schools, its first system of accounting. And the 60-minute hour you checked this morning without thinking twice. If any ancient people deserved a clean origin story, it was them. Instead, what geneticists found when they laid Sumerian-era DNA beside the DNA of modern Iraqis living on that same soil opened up something nobody had fully prepared for. This is that story, and it does not end where you think it does. To understand why the DNA comparison landed so hard, you have to first understand what the Sumerians left behind and what they did not. On the left behind side, the list is almost embarrassing in its richness. Tens of thousands of clay tablets pressed with cuneiform, the world's first writing system, have been recovered from the soil of southern Iraq. These tablets record everything: hymns to gods, astronomical observations, medical diagnoses, trade agreements, school exercises written by children learning to carve signs into wet clay, and administrative records so detailed that scholars today can reconstruct the daily calorie intake of Sumerian temple workers. The first named author in all of human history was a Sumerian woman named Enheduanna, a princess and high priestess who wrote hymns around 2300 BC that still read with genuine emotional force. The Sumerians documented flood myths, creation stories, and a king list that claims rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years before the Great Deluge, narratives that would echo forward into the Hebrew Bible and beyond. They built ziggurats. They engineered irrigation systems across a landscape that had no business growing wheat. They developed mathematics capable of calculating compound interest and the area of irregular fields. They tracked the movements of Venus. They split the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes, a numerical system based on the number 60 that we still use today, embedded so deep into civilization that most people never question where it came from. And then there is the did not leave behind side. Bones, cells, DNA, themselves. Southern Mesopotamia, the flat, sweltering land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where Sumerian cities rose, is one of the worst environments on Earth for ancient genetic material to survive. Heat destroys DNA. Moisture destroys DNA. Southern Iraq has both in abundance. The same rivers that made the floodplain fertile enough to birth the world's first cities also saturated the soil with the exact conditions that reduced biological material to fragments too small to sequence. A century and a half of excavation across sites like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash has turned up enormous quantities of artifacts and almost no usable ancient DNA. The civilization that invented record-keeping left almost no biological record of itself. That paradox, a people who documented everything, preserved in everything except their own genetics, set the stage for what researchers would have to do next. When you cannot read the DNA of a vanished people directly, you look for the next best thing: their living relatives. And in the marshlands of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates merge before emptying into the Persian Gulf, there exists a community that has drawn the attention of archaeologists, anthropologists, and geneticists for decades. The Marsh Arabs, known in Arabic as the Madan, have been living among the reeds and waterways of this region for as long as any recorded history reaches. Their houses are built from bundled reeds in a style that appears in Sumerian artistic reliefs dating back more than 4,000 years. Their boats follow hull designs visible in ancient Mesopotamian seals. Their methods of fishing, their water buffalo culture, their reed island construction, all of it carries the visual signature of the earliest Sumerian records. No other living community on Earth sits so directly on the cultural footprint of ancient Sumer. In 2011, geneticist Nadia Al-Zahiri and colleagues at the University of Pavia published results from a study of 143 Marsh Arab men, each verified to have at least 4 generations of Marsh ancestry. The researchers analyzed 2 separate inheritance channels: the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son and traces the patrilineal line, and mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child and traces the matrilineal line. The maternal results were unremarkable, a typical mix for the Middle Eastern region, nothing that screamed ancient signal. Then the paternal results came back. Nearly 74% of the men in the sample shared a single paternal haplogroup, J1P58. When the broader J haplogroup was counted, the figure climbed to approximately 85%. For a sense of how extreme that number is, consider that most human populations are a mosaic of paternal lines, reflecting centuries of migration, conquest, trade, and intermarriage from multiple directions. To find nearly 3/4 of a population sharing one specific patrilineal branch is, in population genetics terms, extraordinary. It points to one of 2 things. Either an event in the distant past caused this line to multiply explosively while others faded, or the population was geographically sealed long enough for genetic drift to whittle everything else away. Where does J1P58 originate? When researchers mapped the internal diversity of this lineage, because a genetic line accumulates the most variation where it has lived the longest, the center of gravity pointed not to southern Iraq, but to upper Mesopotamia and southeastern Turkey, with thinner threads reaching toward the Arabian Peninsula, the Ethiopian highlands, and the eastern Mediterranean. In other words, the dominant paternal fingerprint of the people most closely associated with the ancient Sumerians does not appear to have started where Sumerian civilization ended up. It appears to have traveled in from the north, following the river valleys down into the floodplain. That single finding cracked the old, comfortable story wide open. A Y chromosome lineage is not just a family tree. It is also a clock. Every generation, DNA accumulates small, predictable mutations at specific locations. Count those mutations, run the mathematics backward, and you can estimate when a particular branch of the family tree underwent a sudden, dramatic expansion, the moment when a small group began multiplying at a rate that swamped competing lines. When Al-Zahiri's team applied this method to J1P58, the estimated date of expansion landed at approximately 4,500 years ago. And that number hit the research community like a thrown stone hitting still water. 4,500 years ago is the late early dynastic and Akkadian period of Mesopotamian history. It is the era when Sumerian city-states were at or near the height of their complexity. Ur was a city of tens of thousands of inhabitants. Uruk, possibly the world's first true metropolis, had already been standing for centuries. Monumental architecture, professional armies, palace economies, long-distance trade networks reaching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. All of it was either fully operational or reaching its apex during the window when this single paternal line appears to have erupted outward through the population. The alignment between the greatest urban flowering the ancient world had yet seen and the explosive spread of one bloodline is not something a researcher can look at casually and move on. In a world where powerful men, kings, generals, high priests, left far more surviving offspring than ordinary laborers, the founding and consolidation of cities would have concentrated certain patrilineal lines dramatically. The genetics appeared to be recording exactly that, the moment urban hierarchy took hold and stamped itself into the genome of the land. But here is where intellectual honesty demands a hard stop. That 4,500-year figure comes with a margin of error of approximately plus or minus 2,600 years. That margin is not a footnote. It is not a minor qualification. It means the actual expansion of J1P58 could have occurred as early as 7,100 years ago, well before any Sumerian city existed, or as recently as 1,900 years ago, long after Sumer had dissolved into history. The dating method used, based on Y chromosome short tandem repeats, has been criticized by geneticists for exactly this kind of imprecision. The number that aligned so beautifully with the first cities is simultaneously the number most vulnerable to being wrong. Any honest account of this research has to sit with that discomfort rather than paper over it. The Marsh Arab study worked from the living side of the equation. The complementary breakthrough came from the ancient side, and it arrived in 2022. A team affiliated with Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, led by researchers including Iraqi Harney and David Reich, succeeded in extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from Neolithic-era individuals in Mesopotamia. The critical detail is geography. The samples did not come from the southern floodplain, where the climate made DNA recovery impossible. They came from northern Mesopotamia, where slightly cooler and drier conditions had been merciful enough to leave biological material intact after thousands of years. What those genomes revealed overturned the simplest version of Sumerian origins that had been taught for generations. The Neolithic people of northern Mesopotamia were not a single, isolated, locally rooted population. They were a genetic blend. Their ancestry carried contributions from Levantine hunter-gatherers to the southwest, from Anatolian farming communities to the northwest, and, most significantly for the Sumerian question, a substantial stream flowing in from the east, from the Caucasus and from the Zagros mountain range, the chain running along what is now western Iran. This eastern stream matters enormously. It means that even the Ubaid culture, the pre-Sumerian farming society of southern Mesopotamia that most earlier scholarship had treated as the pure local ancestor of the Sumerians, was already genetically mixed by the time Sumerian civilization coalesced. The clean origin story was always a fiction. The people of the plains had been absorbing highland blood from the Zagros for so long that by the time the first cuneiform sign was pressed into clay, the population standing in those cities was already the product of a long-running encounter between multiple ancestral streams. A 2025 study analyzing ancient DNA from the eastern Zagros region, covering the Bronze Age through the Persian imperial period, added a critical dimension to this picture. That eastern population, the one that contributed so heavily to Mesopotamian ancestry, did not move in once and disappear. The genetic signal shows they remained in continuous contact with the river valley populations across thousands of years, straight through Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Persian dominance. The link between the mountain people and the city builders was not a single ancient migration. It was an ongoing relationship. When researchers turned from the Marsh Arabs to the broader Iraqi population, the picture became richer and more complex. The near-homogeneous J1 P58 signal of the Marsh Arabs, that extraordinary concentration of one paternal line, loosens considerably when you zoom out to Iraq as a whole. J1 drops to around 31% nationally. J2, a related but distinct haplogroup associated with Anatolia and the northern Fertile Crescent, appears at roughly 24%. R1 lineages, traceable to populations from the Iranian Plateau and Central Asia, account for approximately 21%. Other lines fill in the remaining fraction. The reason for this broader spread is not mystery. It is history. In the 4,000 years since Sumerian city-states declined, the land between the rivers was absorbed into empire after empire. Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Achaemenid Persian, Macedonian Greek under Alexander, Parthian, Sassanid Persian, Arab Islamic, Mongol, and Ottoman Turkish rule. Each of these political transformations brought populations of men, soldiers, administrators, merchants, and settlers who left genetic traces in the contemporary Iraqi gene pool. One of the most striking patterns in the modern Iraqi data is the asymmetry between paternal and maternal lineages. Roughly 30% of Iraqi Y chromosomes carry lineages traceable to distant regions. In mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, that figure drops to approximately 9%. The interpretation is straightforward but sobering. The waves of conquerors and migrants who entered Mesopotamia were overwhelmingly male. The women of the region, across invasion after invasion, stayed. The maternal line held its ground through every political upheaval, carrying forward the ancient Mesopotamian genetic core, while empires rose and fell on the surface. Among Iraqi Jews, Assyrians, and Mandeans, communities separated by religion and language, but rooted in the same geography. Researchers find the same foundational genetic substrate beneath the surface differences. The Sumerian-era core, diluted and enriched by subsequent history, is not the exclusive property of the Marsh Arabs. It runs through the broader Iraqi population. The Marsh Arabs are simply the most concentrated dose of what every Iraqi carries to some degree. The genetic evidence points to a population that was thoroughly mixed, connected to its neighbors, and embedded in the broader genetic flow of the ancient Near East. That picture stands in jarring contrast to a different line of evidence: the Sumerian language. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no demonstrated relatives, living or extinct. It belongs to no language family. Every other major language spoken in the ancient world can be traced to a broader family: Semitic, Indo-European, Dravidian, Sino-Tibetan. Sumerian stands entirely alone. Linguists have been searching for a century for any credible connection to another tongue and have found nothing convincing. The language did not descend from Akkadian, did not precede it in a way that makes them relatives, and shares no demonstrable structural ancestry with any language spoken anywhere on the planet before or after. This isolation is genuinely strange when set against the genetic picture. How can a people whose blood was thoroughly mixed with the surrounding region speak a language that appears to have no connection to any of those same regions? Geneticists have now confirmed that the ancestors of the Sumerians came from the Levant, from Anatolia, from the Caucasus, from the Zagros. All of those regions had languages. None of those languages appears to be the ancestor of Sumerian. The most honest answer is that language and genes travel differently. A population can adopt a new language without changing its blood. A language can spread through prestige, commerce, or political power into a population whose ancestry is entirely different from the language's original speakers. Conversely, a language can survive in a community that has absorbed extensive outside blood through trade, marriage, and conquest. The Sumerian case may represent a language that originated in a community we have not yet located genetically, or one whose speakers were absorbed into the larger Mesopotamian population while their tongues survived long enough to define an entire civilization's cultural identity. What it definitely means is that the old instinct, the assumption that a unique culture must come from a genetically unique, isolated people, does not survive contact with evidence. For anyone willing to sit with a degree of productive uncertainty, there is one more thread worth pulling. Sumerian mythology returned again and again to the east, to mountains, to high places where the gods resided and from which the gifts of civilization descended. The sacred city of Dilmun was somewhere to the east or southeast. The mountain of the gods, the place where creation began, was elevated and eastern. Scholars spent most of the 20th century treating these geographical orientations as religious metaphor, the kind of cosmological East as origin narrative that many cultures share and that rarely maps onto actual geography. The genetics now point east as well, toward the Zagros, toward the highlands from which a substantial portion of Mesopotamian ancestry appears to have descended over thousands of years. Whether Sumerian mythology was preserving a genuine cultural memory of an actual Eastern origin, a memory passed down through hundreds of generations in the form of sacred story, or whether the geographic parallel is coincidental, cannot be proven with current evidence. But it can no longer be dismissed as easily as it once was. A memory encoded in myth, surviving 4,000 years of empire, linguistic transformation, conquest, and cultural change, only to be partially confirmed by a genetic study conducted in a modern laboratory. That is either one of the most remarkable coincidences in intellectual history, or it is evidence that human cultures carry deeper traces of their own origins than we typically credit them for. The honest conclusion of all this research is not a solved mystery. It is a better-defined, unsolved one. Everything established so far, the J1P58 concentration in the Marsh Arabs, the Eastern Zagros ancestry in Neolithic Mesopotamians, the asymmetric invasion signal in modern Iraqi DNA, rests on proxy evidence. It is a portrait of the Sumerians, assembled almost entirely from the genetics of their descendants and neighbors, not from the Sumerians themselves. The primary source is still missing. Ancient DNA extracted directly from Sumerian burial sites in southern Mesopotamia, from Ur, from Uruk, from Eridu, has never been successfully recovered. The climate saw to that. Until such samples can be obtained and sequenced, the genetic story of Sumer remains inference, however well-grounded. The political and logistical obstacles to obtaining those samples are real and not easily resolved. Sites in southern Iraq sit beneath modern cities, inside regions damaged by decades of conflict, or behind permitting processes frozen by ongoing instability. Even if excavation were possible tomorrow, the same humid heat that destroyed the DNA in the first place would still be waiting in the soil. Science advances on the margins of what is possible. Extraction techniques improve. New sites are discovered. Political circumstances change. The answer is not unreachable in principle. It is simply not here yet. Here is what the research, taken in full, actually suggests. The Sumerians did not vanish. The name disappeared. The language died. The cities sank into tells under accumulating centuries of sediment. But the people, the biological inheritance of those who built Ur and invented writing and split the hour into 60 minutes, did not evaporate. They became Babylonians and Assyrians, and then subjects of Persia, and then Greek, and then Arab, and then Ottoman. They changed what they called themselves with every regime change. Their language was replaced, first by Akkadian, then Aramaic, then Arabic. By the Islamic period, no one in southern Iraq would have called themselves Sumerian or understood what the word meant. But in the marshes, a concentrated remnant of the ancient paternal line kept living in reed houses above water, following patterns their ancestors had followed for 4,000 years. And throughout the broader population of Iraq, the same foundation, mixed ancient mountain and plain, continued forward under newer names, newer faiths, newer languages. Modern Iraqis are not the descendants of the Sumerians in the sense of being a pure continuation of one ethnic line. No such line has ever existed anywhere. They are the descendants of everything that happened in that river valley from the Neolithic forward. The first farmers, the highland migrants, the city builders, the conquerors, the traders, and the women who stayed through all of it and carried the oldest signal forward in their mitochondrial DNA. The Sumerians did not disappear into history. They dissolved into it. And dissolution is not the same as death. A civilization can lose its temples, its empire, its written language, and its very name, and still refuse to actually be gone. As long as there are people living between those two rivers, the oldest signature in the written world is still there, moving through living bodies, completely unaware of what it carries. That might be the most quietly disturbing truth the DNA comparison revealed. Not that the Sumerians vanished, but that they never did.